360-degree view of Africa.
Welcome back to Transafrica Radio, Views of Africa. This is a very interesting a part of the show where we're joined by guests in our studio. And this guest, as I said before we went on the break, he's a person after my heart. He's traveled extensively across Africa, putting deals together, transactions, as I say, and obviously he has a lot of experience in deal making. His name is Olatunde Olaniawo. He's an ex-Accenture, ex-PwC, a deal maker of note, and we're very happy to have him in our studio today. Welcome to our studio, Mr. Olaniawo.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Interestingly, this month has been, very exciting for us on the continent. We just had successful elections in Nigeria, Africa's largest economy. We have a new president-elect, even though he's 72. I call him brand new in the box because he's never been a civilian president. And I'm sure in the conversation we're going to have, or the questions we're going to ask you, you're probably going to talk about Nigeria's economy. Obviously, last year was exactly a year ago when it was declared by the Statistician General as the largest economy, $510 billion. Of course, some of that has been reduced by the decline in the price of oil. So in fact, let's just go straight to it. The first question I have for you, Mr. Olaniawo, is a very simple question. For the past decade or so, many African economies have seen growth at about 7% on a yearly basis. But despite this, we've seen a turnaround. What do you think is the reason for that turnaround?
Okay. Well, my take on that is that a lot of people have always said that the growth that we've experienced in Africa in the last 10 years has been as a result of high commodity prices. So now we have a situation where crude oil prices are falling. A country like Nigeria, which is the biggest oil producer on the continent, has had its growth figures revised by the IMF and the World Bank to just under 5% from over 6%. So that plays a part. Then we look at South Africa. I like to talk about the two, although there are other economies doing well in Africa. But those are the two powerhouses of the continent, I would say. So you have a situation in South Africa as well. You've had growth being revised. For example, the IMF revised South Africa's growth from 2.3% to 2.1%. Now that's been as a result of, again, investment weakness, the strikes. So productivity has been, labor productivity, effectiveness has been an issue. Then you have things to do with structural constraints around electricity supply. So all that has affected South Africa as an economy in terms of growth.
Right.
And of course, commodity prices, the mining sector is down as well. When China is not spending money, that tends to affect emerging economies or developing economies like we have in Africa. So that's played a factor.
Okay. Now let's look. That leads me to another question. 13 years ago, in fact, I was actually there in Durban, July 2002. I was very excited. The OAU changed, they dropped one letter from OAU to AU. Organization of African Unity becomes African Union. I recall that some of the biggest men, they call them big men, Gaddafi, Eyadema, Arab Moi, Bakili Muluzi, and so on. John Kufuor was there, even Thabo Mbeki was president at the time, and Olusegun Obasanjo was there with Bouteflika. And it was such a big event. I think Gaddafi's speech was about 2 hours long. And that was at the same time that they set up the new partnership for Africa's development with Bouteflika and Wade in Senegal and Mbeki and Obasanjo. They were the drivers of NEPAD. Now, even after over a decade, regional economic integration in Africa still sits at just over 10%, about 12%. Now, what do you think is the reason for that low level of economic interface between the countries and on the continent?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. That's actually quite an interesting question. It's an area that we should develop on in Africa. Intra-Africa trade is very low. I mean, when we look at continents like Europe, America, in North America, intra-trade within North America is about 40%.
Wow.
Europe is 60%.
Wow.
Africa, you've mentioned 10%. But that's as a result of many things. For example, infrastructural challenges is an issue. You also have situations where governments have signed up to regional trade agreements and they haven't followed up or actually fulfilled their obligations around those trade agreements. So that's been a huge bottleneck as to, trading within the continent. And again, we have a situation in Africa whereby we sell raw materials, we produce raw materials which we export to the rest of the world, mainly Europe, America, Asia, and the likes. But we're not producing enough manufactured goods. So that hinders our ability to trade within each other. That is also a factor. And also transport, moving things around. Logistics, an effective supply chain. Those are things that hinders us in Africa doing business together. And another important thing is efficiency around border controls, the right institutions in place to get things. It can be a nightmare. Even just.
What about currencies?
Currencies, exactly. I mean, there's just
33 currencies.
There's a multi-currency situation in Africa, which is a big factor. I mean, we compared to Europe or North America, people standardize on the dollar, fair enough. Europe, you have the European Union and the euro, which helps to facilitate trade. So those are the issues that affect us.
Okay, and also some of those currencies, in fact, many of them have now taken a knock.
Yes,
I believe the Ghanaian cedi, the Nigerian naira, the South African rand, and so
absolutely, on. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. Let's hope our leaders can get, this thing sorted out.
Sure. Yeah.
But another question that I have for you, Mr. Olaniawo, is Africa is a continent mired in conflict from the Sudan, southern Sudan and Sudan fighting, Central African Republic, where we recall we lost about 13 South African soldiers. I think it was 2 years ago or last year. Libya, where we've seen ISIS move in swiftly, and the country actually has two capitals, two governments running from two capitals, Benghazi and Tripoli. And then, of course, you have Al-Shabaab running amok in Kenya now and again, and Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria. Do you think, given these conflicts, what do you think will be the effect on investments in the long term and short term?
Okay, it does affect investments. You find out that when we speak to, as we all know here, when we speak to our colleagues or people we work or do business with in Europe and America, they like to ask questions about Africa. Recently was at the Colliers Institute in London, which is an institute run by the London Business School. They look at doing deals and trade in Africa, private equity, venture capital type investments. And Africa is not on their radar. Now you ask questions, why? It's all about the perceived state of insecurity, wars. They see Nigeria, for example, as a big market, but they were worried about the elections. Again, worried about the lack of what they called entrenched institutions. That worries them.
Corporate governance.
Although they are aware that that's where Africa is where growth is. They are happy with South Africa, but again concerned about those things we discussed about earlier in the segment. But all that's affecting trade in the short term, not in the long term. They all know that they have to diversify. They have to basically look for new markets, growth in their areas of doing business now in Europe and America, even Asia. Some of the countries there, not as high as what we've been projected for Africa. In terms of countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, even Egypt. Egypt is seeing an upward trend now. Even South Africa has entrenched institutions, but this short-term problem of the strikes, the issue with ESCOM and all of that, those are all short-term matters. So long-term, I do believe the future is bright. They're looking at Africa long-term, especially those countries we have talked about.
Okay. Yes. No, thank you very much. But when we come back, we're obviously going to be asking more questions from our guest. He's given us a lot of information about Africa and the opportunities. We're on Views on Africa, Transafrica Radio. Please don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Transafrica Radio, Views of Africa. Our guest in studio right now, Mr. Olatunde Olaniawo, deal maker, Africa expert on transactions, ex-Accenture, ex-PwC. Mr. Olaniawo, before the break, we were talking about a number of things you're helping us to unpack opportunities in Africa in terms of investment, looking at the investment climate and the reasons why investors will come in, markets, and obviously they're looking at institutions. There needs to be strong institutions, corporate governance. Now, the question I want to ask you, which is also a very important question in my view, having looked at that, those things that you've mentioned already, which country or countries in Africa are the best investment destinations as of today, and why?
Okay. I would pick Nigeria as my number one investment destination because of the growth potential of the country. One, the country has numbers in terms of population, over 170 million people. There's a thriving entrepreneurial culture, which means that there are lots of small to medium enterprises who will develop to be much more thriving businesses in years to come. As the institutions grow and things become more formalized, these firms or these entities too will grow. They'll grow the country. So the time to get in, I believe, is now, not when everything is sorted out, everything is in place. At that point, there's almost nothing there for taking anymore. I would still look at South Africa because South Africa has the best infrastructure on the continent, very well developed financial services industry. So of course it's still the engine of the continent in many ways. So South Africa, but of course it involves looking at niche areas to invest in. So South Africa as well would be a country where I would, if I had $10 million, I would invest in. Of course, there's Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a big growth story. Infrastructure developments, a lot. There's a rail, I believe there's a rail, interrail system being developed in the country right now.
Is that in Addis or across the country?
I believe it's across the country.
Wow.
Right.
Is that the Chinese support?
Correct. I believe it has Chinese support. So there's a lot going on in Ethiopia. But of course, a lot of business people complain about Ethiopia in terms of the closed nature of the way business is done. But I believe that's changing, and that will continue to improve.
Okay.
Kenya, technology hub of the continent.
Wow.
With technology, you don't need to invest too much. You find nice growth areas and invest, bits and pieces of money in them and watch them grow. So I would look at Kenya. And then I wouldn't forget the countries like Tanzania and Mozambique because of the recent oil finds and gas reserves in those industries, in those countries.
Right. So those are the 6 that we should jump into straight away. You said you used the word now, 3 letters. Now. Fascinating. Interestingly, I think African Union is in Addis.
Yes,
the headquarters. That was built by the Chinese for about $200 million.
Yes.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. There's another question that I think is also important because, while we're talking about, you mentioned energy infrastructure in your comments. Which of these 4 areas, the 4 areas that we've listed here, energy, infrastructure, health, of course, corruption, are listed as an area or sector because it bleeds the African balance sheet. So energy, infrastructure, health, and corruption. Which of these 4 areas do you think are most important to Africa's economic growth? Obviously, we're not looking at corruption as a sector, but we're saying because corruption is so endemic that it now looks like a sector on its own.
They are all important, but in terms of priority, I believe infrastructural development, healthcare, and stamping out corruption are the most important 3 areas.
Okay.
Because we do need infrastructure in Africa. Countries like Nigeria, with our teeming population and the growth, we do need infrastructure. Healthcare is also important because Africa has the highest percentage of youth population in the world. As these segment of the population grow, we need to look after them. To have a healthy workforce, we need to have a good healthcare system in place. And of course, all of this would make no sense without stamping out corruption. It would be difficult to do business if the continent is still perceived as corruption friendly. Institutional investors will be loath to come in because they will be worried. And of course, energy. Energy being important in the sense that you need energy to drive the economy. Gas reserves, crude oil, petrol, the refined products that comes from all of that. So they're all important areas.
Because machines have to work, right?
They have to work. Correct.
Right.
Yes.
And which brings us, thank you for that, and which brings us to the final question that we have, which is also, I think it's a very important question. Which sector of the economy would you think, in your view, will create the most jobs in 2015 and why?
Agribusiness.
Wow.
Emphatically, agribusiness.
Right.
Going into mechanized farming, the whole ecosystem around agriculture.
The value chain.
Is where the growth, I believe a lot of things will happen there.
Because people must eat every day, right?
Would eat every
Sometimes
day.
10 times a day, if you're lucky.
That's correct. So that is the area that I would.
Fantastic. So agribusiness.
That's right.
And those 6 countries, if we can recap that, is Ethiopia, Nigeria first. You mentioned Ethiopia, South Africa second, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania.
Yes.
So these will be the 6 African tigers, as it were.
In my estimation.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Olaniawo, for coming to our studio. You guys have heard it from the horse's mouth. A deal maker, an Africa expert, transactional advisory strategy. We're very lucky to have him here in our studio. Thank you very much. And now we will go to Nonya. Nonya, you obviously have a question for Mr. Olaniawo.
I was listening intently, and obviously in terms of the markets, I can see that some of the markets that we are focusing on are because of the large population and in terms of consumerism, a lot of things can happen in those markets. One of the things I wanted to ask you is that a lot of companies, when they go into do business across Africa, they seemingly try to adopt a one-size-fits-all. What are some of the differences that you've seen among some of the countries that you visited in terms of consumer insights, lifestyles, demographics? Obviously, we see that they're a young population, but what are the similarities or somewhat differences?
Okay. Thanks for that, Noye. Yes, some firms, when they go into Africa, try to go with a one-size-fits-all mentality. and that basically comes back to bite them ultimately. A big example is Telkom South Africa, unfortunately. I believe that Telkom went into Nigeria without taking into consideration some of the national idiosyncrasies and peculiarities of the country. If something worked in South Africa or Malawi or Botswana or even Kenya, it doesn't mean it will work in Nigeria or in any other country for that matter. MTN has been very successful because they have adapted to the local market in terms of doing business. For example, we know when they started, they attracted a lot of Nigerians from diaspora back to Nigeria. And of course, they have 2001. And then they had a very diverse and enterprising young shareholder base, the original shareholders, and that's helped them in doing business. So I believe the way it's got to, a one size fits all does not work in Africa. It is what we try to tell our European and American colleagues as well when we are strategizing about Africa in the consulting and advisory world, that we need to take cognizance of local peculiarities. It's very important, and I believe people are beginning to see that. Gone are the days when someone will call themselves an expert. They'll come from Europe and America, and they're trying to tell us how to do things here.
Especially not in Nigeria. They won't accept it. It's not going to work.
Initially, some are resistant, but after a while, when they keep when they hit roadblocks, then they come back. But
So is it very important for them at least to make sure that they use local talent and look at your research, do lots of research, and don't just come in and expect that what happened in Kenya would happen in Nigeria or Tanzania, so to speak. So yeah, that's very good.
That's what they call local content.
Local content, yeah, and making sure you employ the right kind of structure, balance of workforce, because one of the other things, I mean, we say that the youth is a large percentage of our population, and I heard you say some parts of Nigeria there's entrepreneurialism is quite strong, but what can when we look at Africans across, when we look at the youth across the whole of Africa, what can they do to empower themselves currently? What can they do to empower themselves when you look at particular issues which are currently, maybe not so nice, such as xenophobia here in South Africa, bad infrastructure, corruption? What can the youth now do to change what they have seen the people in front of them do? What can they do different?
The beautiful thing about the youth we have in Africa is that the youth are so enterprising. New technology, new media, social media and all of that has given the youth a voice. This is something that is transforming. It's actually transforming business and transforming the way things are done. By not waiting for government to do anything for them is where I believe the youth has power. Just, believe in your ideas, implement them. Let's not just think about stuff, start to execute and do things as well.
Don't be afraid to fail.
Don't be afraid to fail. Failure is actually quite necessary for success. You fail, then you learn from that, and then you succeed. I believe that's the way forward, not waiting for government.
So it's not too late for any of us then?
No, it's not too late for us.
And I think what is also interesting that one would like to add to that, if you look at the genre of the creative industries like music, I think that Africa's youth, they've really done very well. Your Whiskies, all those guys, Davido, these guys are under 30 and they really have a huge following.
Yes.
And I think sometimes, when you look at somebody like a Michael Jackson, for example.
Right.
So who is Africa's Michael Jackson? Because, when you look at Nicki Minaj and all that, who's Africa's Nicki Minaj? Because those guys have created so much, your Kanye West and so on, so much wealth from music, from entertainment.
Yes.
And I think that is also another area in Africa that is not the investment that we see is not significant. And maybe that's also for investors coming onto the continent, beyond agriculture, beyond infrastructure, is an area where I think they can tap into.
Great.
I think one of the things I admire about the Black Americans is that they bought into what their strengths are. So they've bought into music, they've bought into entertainment, they've bought into sport, and they get on with it.
Yes.
So whilst there might be difficulties and there's issues in terms of race relations and all of this, the black people themselves, they have come together and they know what they're good at. They know what they're good at, and they export.
Yeah.
And I think for us on the continent, what is it that we know we're good at?
Absolutely.
And I think that's where we have our strength.
Because we need to create our own LeBron James, Michael Jordan, people like Richard Roundtree, the Shaft in Africa guy,
Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah Winfrey, or Barack Obama.
Yes.
I think also Michelle Obama. What I think is important is because you're in the deal flow business, it's important also to tell those investors, especially institutional investors, that this sector has shown far more growth than your traditional property and mining and so on, with little resources like your Nollywood and so on, with little investment. And I think that is what we saw the finance minister of Nigeria talk about when they came for a state visit, that they saw that even without any investment, that this sector was growing. Yes. And now they're looking at how to support them.
That's right.
And so that, for me, is a good part where we say, thank you very much once again to Mr. Olaniawo for coming on Transafrica Radio, Views on Africa. We always enjoy where, Africans are talking about Africa, or from a very clear point of view that this is what we need to do. Those 6 countries now, I'm sure we'll be packing our suitcases to try and align with the opportunities there, and I'm sure our listeners will be prepared to head to those airports in short order. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.